The rain did not cease for her return. It fell in hard, gray sheets, slicking the cobblestones of the outer court and drumming a cold rhythm on the helmets of the gate guards. Ilara walked through the deluge as if she were dry, her pace even, her shoulders set. She wore no finery, only dark, practical wool and leather that had seen weather far worse than this. She did not look at the guards whose spears had crossed to bar her way 6 months ago. She did not look at the sigil of the Blackwood pack carved into the stone arch above her, the sigil that had marked her as kin and then as outcast. Her gaze was fixed on the entrance to the great keep, a dark maw in the stone, and she did not falter. It was not her stillness that made the guards lower their weapons. Their faces pale in the torchlight, it was what came behind her. They emerged from the tree line at the edge of the storm, moving with a silence that was a violation of nature. 2 of them, wolves, but only in the way a thunderhead is a cloud. They were enormous, their shoulders standing as high as a man's chest, their fur the color of storm-racked night. Their eyes were not the gold of the pack, but held a flat, ancient light like chips of obsidian reflecting a dying star. They did not pant or growl, they simply were. They followed Ilara at a distance of 20 paces, their massive paws making no sound on the wet stone, their presence a cold weight in the air. She knew. The heavy, rhythmic fall of rain, then the sudden sharp scrape of a guard's boot on stone as he steps back in fear. The news traveled faster than the woman herself. It was a tremor through the keep, a whispered word that became a panicked rush. By the time Ilara reached the threshold of the throne hall, he was waiting. Alpha King Kalen stood alone at the base of the dais, his throne of iron and weirwood empty behind him. He was a man carved from the same stone as his fortress, all hard lines and controlled force. His stillness was legendary, a weapon in itself. But it was fractured now. Ilara could see it in the rigid line of his jaw, in the way his hands were fisted at his sides instead of resting in their usual placid calm. His gaze was not on her, but on the space just behind her. At the 2 shadows that had halted in the courtyard, their forms framed perfectly by the massive open doors. He looked at them, and for the first time since she had known him, Ilara saw the bedrock of his composure crack. "You were exiled," he said. His voice was low, a rumble of displaced stone. It was not a question. It was an accusation of a broken law, a broken reality. Ilara stopped 10 feet from him. The rainwater dripped from the hem of her cloak, forming a small, dark pool on the polished floor. "I was," she answered. Her voice was not the one he had cast out. That one had been raw with grief and betrayal. This voice was level, calm, honed to an edge. He finally dragged his eyes from the things in the courtyard to her. They were the color of winter sky, and they held a fury so cold it was a physical force. "What are they?" he demanded. She met his gaze without flinching. It was a thing no one did. "What do they look like to you, Kalen?" He took a step forward, the sheer force of his authority washing over her. It was a tide that had once battered her, but now it broke against something unmovable within her. "They look like an act of war," he gritted out. "Then perhaps you should not have started one." She offered nothing more. No explanation for her return, no plea for forgiveness, no justification for the impossible beasts that had followed her out of the dark. She simply stood there, a woman of hidden consequence, returned to the place that had tried to erase her. And the Alpha King, who had faced down armies and pretenders without a flicker of doubt, looked from her to the silent monsters at her back, and did not know what to do. The silence in the throne room stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken history. It was broken by the measured footsteps of Lord Valerius, Kaelin's chief advisor, emerging from the shadows near the dais. He was a man whose pleasant face and mild demeanor were a careful mask for a mind like a steel trap. He had been the loudest voice calling for her exile. His eyes, a warm, deceptive brown, flickered to the courtyard, and a muscle jumped in his jaw before he smoothed his expression into one of concerned gravity. "My king," Valerius said, his voice a balm of reason. "The guards are terrified. The pack feels a disturbance. This cannot be allowed to stand." Kaelin did not look at him. His focus was entirely on Alara, a predator's focus, trying to find a weakness, a seam in her new armor. "She will be contained," Kaelin said, the words clipped. The North Tower. Alara's expression did not change, but something inside her went cold and still. The North Tower. The rooms reserved for honored guests for visiting dignitaries. For her, before she had been dragged from them and cast out. It was a calculated cruelty, a reminder of what she had lost. Or perhaps, she thought, it was the only place he believed could hold her and the creatures, Valerius pressed, his tone laced with a delicate, dismissive disgust. Kaelin's gaze shifted back to the courtyard. The two great wolves had not moved. They had lain down, their massive forms curled on the wet stones, their obsidian eyes fixed on the keep. They were waiting. "They will be watched," Kaelin decreed. "No one is to approach them." No one. He finally turned to the captain of his guard, who hovered nervously by the entrance. "Take her." The command was absolute. The guards moved, their reluctance warring with their duty. Alara did not resist. She turned, her wet cloak swirling around her, and walked between them. As she passed the threshold, she felt Kaelin's eyes on her back, a physical weight. She did not need to see his face, to know his control was back in place, a mask of iron locked over the fissure she had created. But she had seen it. She had seen the crack, and that was enough. The room in the North Tower was exactly as she remembered it. And that was the most brutal part. The heavy damask curtains, the carved oak bed, the cold stone hearth that had never held a fire warm enough to touch the chill in her bones. They had not even bothered to clear away her things. A silver-backed brush lay on the vanity. A book of poetry lay open on the bedside table, its pages slightly curled from the damp. It was as if she had only stepped out for a moment, not been driven into the unforgiving wilds to die. She ran a hand over the cool, dusty cover of the book. A hollow ache, familiar and sharp, pulsed in her chest. This was his message. "You are a ghost here. This life is no longer yours." The guards had locked the door from the out-fare sled. Final thud of a heavy bolt sliding home. She was a prisoner in her own past. She went to the window, a tall, narrow slit in the stone, and looked down. Far below, in the courtyard, the two wolves remained. They were unbothered by the rain, by the fearful stares of the guards patrolling the ramparts. They were monuments of loyalty, their stillness a promise and a threat. They were watching the tower, her tower. A strange comfort settled over her. She was not alone. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight, and she waited. She knew he would come. He had to. The king, with a fractured composure, with two impossible beasts sitting on his doorstep, had no other choice. Hours passed. The storm abated, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The sounds of the keep were muted. a nervous hum of activity that never quite reached her door. They brought her a tray of food, bread, cheese, wine, and left it outside. She did not touch it. Hunger was an old, dull companion. She had learned to ignore its whining. It was near midnight when the bolt on her door was drawn back. The grating sound of metal on metal, slow and deliberate. Kalen entered alone. He did not bring guards. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. He was a shadow in the moonlight slanting through the window, his size and presence seeming to shrink the room. He had shed his formal tunic for a simple, black shirt and trousers, the attire of a warrior, not a king. He stopped in the center of the room, the same spot where he had stood 6 months ago, when he'd told her the council's verdict, exile. The word had been a stone, and it had shattered her world. Now, he stood on the same spot, and the world was his. "They haven't moved," he said. It was not an opening. It was a continuation of the argument that had begun in the throne hall. "They are patient," Alara replied, her voice quiet in the dark room. She remained seated on the bed, forcing him to be the one who stood, the one who loomed. It was a small reversal of power, but it was something. "I want to know what they are." "I already told you. They are what they look like." "Do not play games with me, Ilara." Her name on his lips was a strange thing. It had once been a comfort, a secret whispered in rooms like this. Now it was a weapon he was unaccustomed to wielding, its edge turned back on him. "The game was yours, Kalen," she said, her voice dropping lower. "You and your council. You set the board. You made the rules. And you swept my pieces from it when you were done. The game is over." He moved then, a slow, deliberate prowl to the window. He looked down at the courtyard, at the two silent guardians. His profile was stark against the pale light, a study in contained violence. The elders speak of legends, shadow walkers, the first pack. They say they were ghosts, myths to frighten pups. Some myths are truer than others. He turned from the window, his eyes finding hers in the gloom. "They listen to you." It was a statement of fact, one that held a universe of disbelief and something else. Something that might have been fear, if Kalen were capable of such an emotion. It was closer to a profound, unsettling awe. "They do not listen," she corrected him softly. "They witness." He was still for a long moment, processing the distinction. Listening implied command. Witnessing implied something else, entirely a judgment, a bearing of truth. "Witness what?" he asked, his voice rough. Ilara finally stood, her movements fluid and silent. She crossed the room to the hearth, her back to him. She rested her hand on the cold stone of the mantelpiece. "My exile," she said simply, and everything that came after, the confession hung in the air between them, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. It was more than he had ever expected to get from her, and far less than he needed. He could feel the shape of the truth just beyond his reach, shrouded in the stubborn, wounded pride she now wore like armor. He had put it there. He had forged it himself, with his decree, with his refusal to listen to her side, with his rigid adherence to a law Valerius had so conveniently championed. "The law was clear," he said, his voice hard, as if trying to convince himself. "An Omega who challenges a direct edict of the council during the scarcity conclave must be cast out." "You knew the law." "I challenged a lie," she whispered to the hearth, her fingers tracing the cold stone. "I said Valerius was hoarding grain in his private stores while the lower pack starved. It was not a challenge. It was the truth. A truth for which you had no proof, and for which you would not seek any." Silence. The accusation landed and did not glance off. It sunk deep. He had the power to order a search, to question Valerius, to look deeper. But he had not. The council's unity, the stability of the pack, had seemed more important than the wild claims of a single Omega, even one he had cared for. He had chosen order over truth. And this was the result. Two impossible beasts in his courtyard and a ghost in his tower. "Why come back?" he asked, his voice raw with a frustration he could not conceal. "If you have them, if you have this power, why return here? For revenge?" She finally turned to face him. Her eyes in the moonlight were dark and deep, holding a sorrow that was no longer fragile, but ancient and unyielding. "You think this is about you," she said, and it was not an accusation, but a statement of pity. "You have no idea what is coming, do you?" Before he could demand an answer, a horn blast echoed from the ramparts, a single, sharp, urgent call, the signal for an imminent threat within the walls. Kalen was instantly alert, his head snapping toward the door. Another horn blast followed. Closer this time from the barracks, Alara looked toward the window. Down in the courtyard, the two great wolves were on their feet. Their heads were raised, their obsidian eyes fixed, not on the tower, but on the eastern wing of the keep, the wing that housed the royal granaries and the private stores of Lord Valerius. He paused, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. The question was, in his eyes, stark and demanding. "Someone is forcing your hand," Alara said, her voice calm, a strange counterpoint to the rising alarm outside. "Someone who doesn't want you to have the time to ask me any more questions." She saw the understanding dawn in his face. The realization that he was not the only player moving pieces on this board. He had been so focused on the threat she presented. He had failed to see the one that had been standing beside him all along. The hallway was chaotic. Guards, running, voices, shouting. He gave one last look at Alara, a look that held a new, dawning suspicion and a grudging, unwilling respect. Then he was gone, swallowed by the emergency he had not foreseen. Alara walked back to the window. She watched as Kalen emerged in the courtyard below, his commands cutting through the panic like a blade. He was sending men toward the eastern wing, but his gaze for a split second went to the two wolves. They met his stare, unblinking, before turning their massive heads in unison and melting back into the shadows of the main gate, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. They had made their point. The threat was not them. It was within. The keep remained on high alert for the rest of the night. From her window, Alara watched the frantic movements of torchlight, listened to the distant, angry shouts. It was a well-executed piece of theater. A small fire quickly extinguished had been set near the granary, a diversion. A message to Kalen: "Deal with the woman or I will create chaos you cannot control." It was Valerius's move, and it was a clever one. It painted Alara as the source of instability, her mere presence an invitation to disaster. It pressured Kalen to be the decisive Alpha King, to eliminate the strange, frightening variable she represented. She knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in her veins, that the next time Kalen came to her, it would not be for answers. It would be for a resolution. She spent the long hours mapping her own history onto the walls of the room, the faint scratch near the floor where she dropped a fire poker as a girl, the slight discoloration on the ceiling above where her candle always sat. The window ledge, worn smooth by her hands as she looked out at a kingdom she believed was her own. She had been a fool. Love, she had learned, was a currency, and she had spent it on a man who valued his crown more. The wound was old now, scarred over, but the memory of the blade was still sharp. It was that memory that had kept her alive in the wastes. That and the cold, clean purpose of survival. The sun was a pale smear in the eastern sky when the door opened again. This time he did not hesitate. Kalen strode in, his face a mask of stone. He was once again the king, armored in duty and authority. He carried a small wooden box. "The council has been convened," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He placed the box on the vanny. The sound of wood being set down carefully on wood. "They have voted. Your presence and that of the creatures you brought with you is a threat to the stability of the Blackwood Pack. The old laws are clear on this. Unexplained magic a challenge to the Alpha's authority. It is a death sentence." Elara looked at the box, then at him. She felt a profound weariness settle over her. It was all so predictable. The fear, the politics, the men who would rather burn a miracle than try to understand it. And you, Kalen, the king who sits above the council, what was your vote? She asked, her voice flat. He did not answer. His silence was the vote. He had stood with them. With Valerius. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were two objects: a silver vial filled with a milky liquid and a single, wickedly sharp dagger with a hilt of polished jet. "The law allows for a choice," he said, his gaze fixed on the contents of the box. "Poison, quick and painless. Or the blade for a warrior's death. It is the only mercy I can offer. The only mercy." The words were ashes in her mouth. He was offering her the choice of her own execution, framing it as a kindness. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost enough to make her laugh. She walked toward him, stopping until she stood directly before the vanity, the box between them. She looked at her own reflection in the silver-backed brush lying next to it, a stranger with haunted eyes and hair that had lost its luster. Then she looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time since her return. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that never truly left him. She saw the king, trapped inside the cage of his own making. "There is a third option," she said softly. He finally looked up from the box, his winter sky eyes meeting hers. "There is not. There is," she insisted. "You could believe me." The words fell into the silence, simple and devastating. It was the one thing he had never done. It was the one thing he was still refusing to do. He was choosing the familiar, ugly certainty of his laws over the terrifying, unknown possibility that she was telling the truth. "Belief is a luxury I cannot afford," he said, his voice rough. "My duty is to the pack, to their safety. Their fear is real, Elara. Those things in the courtyard. Their fear is being manipulated." She cut him off, her voice gaining a hard edge. "By the same man who manipulated you 6 months ago. The fire last night was not a random act of chaos. It was a political move. Valerius is showing you he can destabilize your kingdom whenever he wishes. He is testing your will, Kalen. He wants to see if you will eliminate me, the one person who knows his secret, or if you will falter." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Valerius has served this pack loyally for 40 years. He was my father's advisor, and he watched your father weaken, just as he watches you now," she countered, stepping closer. The space between them crackled with tension. "He doesn't want the throne. He wants the power behind it. He wants a king he can control, Your father was one, and he believes you are another." Every word was a stone aimed at the foundation of his reign. She could see them landing, see the impact in the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wanted to dismiss it, to call it the desperate lies of a condemned woman, but he couldn't. Not after the perfectly timed fire. Not after the way her return had thrown his most trusted advisor into a state of quiet, vicious panic. He looked from her face, so earnest and so terribly wounded, to the box. Poison and steel. The council's justice. Valerius's solution. He reached out his hand, hovering over the dagger. For a heart-stopping second, Alara thought he was going to press it into her hand. Instead, his fingers closed around the wooden box itself. He lifted it, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked to the cold hearth, and with a sudden, violent motion, he threw the box into it. The clatter and crack of wood and glass shattering against stone. The silver vial broke, its milky contents spattering against the soot-blackened bricks. The dagger landed with a metallic ring, its sharp point useless. Kalen turned back to her, his chest rising and falling heavily. He had not made a choice. He had simply refused the ones he was given. "Show me," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Show me the proof." A fragile, dangerous hope flickered within Alara. It was a terrifying feeling, one she had sworn she would never allow herself to feel again. "The proof is not something I can show you," she said. "It is something you must be willing to see. It is buried under years of loyalty and trust. You will have to dig for it. Where do I start?" "With his ledgers," she said without hesitation. "The official ones are pristine, but he keeps a private record. A small leather-bound book with a silver clasp. He is a meticulous man. He would never destroy a record of his own cleverness. He keeps it in his private study, behind a false stone in the wall." To the left of the fireplace, Kalen stared at her, his mind working. It was specific. Too specific to be a simple guess. To know such a thing. She would have had to. "You were his ward before your presentation," Kalen said, the pieces clicking into place. He had forgotten that detail. Valerius had taken her in after her parents died, a seemingly benevolent act. He was not a kind guardian, she said, and the profound understatement hung in the air, thick with all the things she would not say about that time. A new kind of anger began to smolder in Kalen's gut, an anger that was not directed at her. He had a choice to make. He could trust the man who had advised him for years, the man who represented stability and order. Or he could trust the exiled woman who had returned with monsters at her back, who spoke of secrets and lies that could unravel his entire kingdom. He looked at her face, at the unyielding strength that had been forged in the exile he had condemned her to. He had chosen order over truth once before, and it had led to this. He would not make the same mistake again. "Stay here," he said, the words an order, but the tone different. It was not the command of a king to a prisoner. It was the request of one conspirator to another. He turned and left, leaving the door not just unlocked, but slightly ajar. Alara walked over to the hearth and picked up the dagger from the ashes. Its jet hilt was cool in her hand. She did not know if he would find the proof or if he would be walking into a trap. She did not know if Valerius's power was so entrenched that Kalen would be the one to be removed. She only knew that for the first time in 6 months, the game was back on the board. And this time she had her own pieces. The weight was different. This time, it was not the hollow, passive waiting of her prisoner. It was the taut, humming stillness of a hunter. Alara stood by the window, the dagger still in her hand, its weight a strange comfort. She watched the courtyard, not for Kalen's return, but for any sign of alarm, any indication that his search had been discovered. The keep remained quiet. The morning routines began. The smell of baking bread drifted up from the kitchens, a scent of ordinary life that felt alien and distant. An hour passed, then two. The hope that had flickered within her began to feel like a liability, a foolish warmth in the cold reality of her situation. She had staked everything on the chance that Kalen would be willing to see that his pride as king was less than his desire for truth. It was a desperate gamble. A movement below caught her eye. Lord Valerius was crossing the courtyard, walking with his usual unhurried, confident stride. He was speaking with the captain of the guard, a smile on his face. He gestured toward the north tower, a casual, dismissive flick of the wrist. He looked utterly untroubled. Elara's heart sank. Kalen had found nothing, or worse, Valerius had outmaneuvered him. The advisor's gaze lifted, and for a chilling moment his eyes seemed to meet hers, across the distance. The smile on his face did not waver, but it changed. It became knowing, triumphant. He knew. He knew Kalen had gone to him, and he knew he had won. The bolt on her door slid home again, not the slow, heavy grate from before. This was quick, efficient. The sound of a cage being locked for good. Valerius had made his move. Kalen had failed. She was truly trapped now. Despair was a cold tide, and she let it wash over her, let it scour away the last remnants of that foolish hope. She was back where she started, alone, condemned. She looked down at the dagger in her hand, the council's mercy. Perhaps it was the only mercy she would get after all. She closed her eyes, her knuckles white around the hilt. She would not let Valerius have the satisfaction of a public execution. She would not let Kalen have the convenience of a quiet death by poison. It would be her choice, her end, the faint sound of a single stone grinding against stone. Her eyes snapped open. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible, coming from the wall beside the hearth, the wall that backed onto the adjoining guest suite. She watched, her breath held, as a section of the stone masonry shifted inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A figure stepped through, silent as a wraith. It was Kalen. He was not wearing his king's attire, but dark nondescript leather. He held a small, leather-bound book with a silver clasp in his hand. His face was grim, his eyes burning with a cold, controlled fire she had never seen before. "You were right," he said, his voice a low whisper that barely carried across the room. He held up the book. Every lie, every ounce of hoarded grain, every bribe to a council member. It's all here. He even detailed the false testimony he coached the witnesses to give against you. He looked not at her, but at the wall, at the secret passage he had just used. This passage connects all the royal suites. My father had it built. He never told me about it, Valerius knew. He has been listening for years. The betrayal was absolute, a poison that had been seeping into the foundations of his house for a generation. Elara felt a surge of something that was not triumph, but a deep, aching sorrow for him. He had been alone inside his own silence for so long, surrounded by whispers he could not hear. "What will you do?" she asked. "If I bring this before the council, he will deny it?" Kalen said, his mind already working, seeing the political traps. "He will claim I fabricated it with you. His allies on the council will call for my abdication. They will say I am compromised. He has made himself indispensable. To remove him is to tear the pack apart. He was trapped. The truth was a weapon he could not wield without destroying himself. He looked at her then, and she saw the king vanish, leaving only the man, cornered and seeking a way out. "He is expecting me to fail," Kaelin said. "He is expecting me to come back here and carry out your sentence. He will use my weakness for you against me later. But for now, he believes he's in control." "He is," Alara said. "As long as you play by his rules." Kaelin's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "Valerius's weapon is information, timing, the manipulation of appearances. He fights in the shadows with whispers and laws. You cannot beat him on that battlefield. He has been cultivating it for decades." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "But you have a weapon he doesn't understand. One he cannot predict." Her gaze flickered toward the window, down to the courtyard where her silent witnesses had last been seen. Kaelin followed her gaze, and understanding dawned. He had seen them as a threat, a violation. He had not seen them as an asset, as a different kind of power, a power that did not play by the Council's rules. "They will not obey me," he said. "They don't have to," Elara replied. "They just have to be seen. Valerius thinks he has you trapped in here with me. Let's show him who is truly trapped." The plan was simple, audacious, and profoundly dangerous. It relied not on force, but on fear, the fear of the unknown. An hour later, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, the main bell of the keep began to toll, not the frantic peal of an alarm, but a slow, solemn, funereal rhythm, a summons. Every member of the pack, from the lowest servant to the highest lord, was commanded to assemble in the great hall. Valerius arrived with the other council members, his expression one of perfect, sober concern. He took his place to the right of the empty throne, the position of power. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for Kaelin, a faint, predatory smile playing on his lips. He expected the king to appear broken and defeated, to announce the execution of the exile. The great doors to the hall stood open to the night. Kaelin did not enter from the side chambers, as was custom. He walked in through the main doors, from the darkness outside. And he was not alone. Alara walked beside him, not behind him as a supplicant, but at his shoulder as an equal. She wore no finery, only the same dark traveler's clothes, but she moved with a quiet dignity that commanded more attention than any gown. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled pack. Valerius's smile froze on his face. But that was not what broke the stillness. It was what framed them in the doorway. The two great wolves. They did not enter the hall, but stood on the threshold, silent sentinels of impossible size. Their fur seemed to drink the torchlight, and their obsidian eyes swept over the crowd, flat and ancient and utterly devoid of fear. They were not growling, not threatening. Their stillness was the threat. It was a power outside the understanding of the pack, a magic that did not obey the laws of man or wolf. Kaelin and Alara walked the length of the hall in dead silence. The only sound the soft fall of their boots on the stone. They stopped at the foot of the dais. Kaelin did not take the throne. He stood before it, forcing everyone to look at him on their own level. "Lord Valerius," Kaelin said, his voice calm and clear, ringing through the cavernous hall. "You stand accused of high treason." Valerius's composure was flawless. He laughed a short condescending sound. "On what grounds, my king? The ravings of a condemned exile? You have no proof. I have this, Kaelin said, holding up the leather-bound ledger. Valerius's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his mask of indignant innocence slammed back into place. A forgery, planted by this witch to save her own skin. You would believe her over me? Over a lifetime of loyal service? He turned to the other council lords, his voice ringing with passion. You see, he is compromised. His judgment is clouded. He brings this dark magic into our hall and threatens the very foundations of our pack for the sake of an Omega who pressed her. He never finished the sentence. One of the great wolves on the threshold took a single silent step forward. It did not make a sound, but the collective attention of the entire hall snapped to it. The air grew cold. The torches seemed to flicker and dim. The wolf's ancient, intelligent gaze settled on Valerius, and it did not waver. It was not an attack, it was a witnessing, a judgment rendered from a power far older than any council. Valerius fell silent. The sweat on his brow glistened in the torchlight. His arguments, his political maneuvering, his carefully constructed laws, they were meaningless in the face of this. He could not debate with it. He could not bribe it. He could not manipulate it. He had been outmaneuvered by a force he could not comprehend. Kaelin did not need to say another word. He did not need to read from the ledger. The proof was there in the absolute soul-stripping terror on Valerius's face as he stared at the wolf. The rest of the council saw it. The entire pack saw it. They saw a man who was not afraid of a king's justice, but was utterly terrified of a deeper, older truth. Kaelin turned to his royal guard. Seize him. The guards, who had been frozen in awe and fear, hesitated for only a moment. Then their loyalty to their alpha, to the raw power he now commanded, reasserted itself. They moved, and Valerius, for the first time in his life, had no words, no scheme, no escape. His entire world of shadows and whispers had been undone by a single silent step. The aftermath was quiet. Valerius was taken to the dungeons, his power broken not by a blade, but by a look. The council, shamed and exposed, offered their fealty to Kaelin with a new, sober respect. The pack, witnessing the quiet, absolute authority of their king, felt not fear, but a renewed sense of security. The world had shifted, and it had settled into a stronger shape. Ilara did not stay in the hall. As soon as it was done, she turned and walked back out into the night, the two great wolves falling into step behind her. She did not need to hear the pronouncements or the shifting of allegiances. She had done what she returned to do. She had brought the truth into the light. She went to the ramparts overlooking the valley, the same spot where she had once stood with Kaelin, dreaming of a future that had turned to dust. The wind was cold, but it felt clean. It smelled of pine and wet earth and freedom. She leaned against the cold stone, feeling the deep, resonant thrum of the world around her. She was no longer an outcast. She was no longer a ghost. She was something new, something she had not yet found the words for. She heard his footsteps behind her, slow and measured on the stone. Kaelin came to stand beside her, not too close, but sharing the same space, the same silence. He did not look at her, but out at the dark, sleeping valley. The two wolves had settled a short distance away, their forms merging with the shadows, their presence a quiet comfort. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not the strained, angry thing it had been in the tower room. It was different now. It was a space that could hold the weight of all that had happened between them. The law of exile is absolute, Kaelin said finally, his voice low. It cannot be unwritten. Ilara felt a familiar pang of disappointment but did not let it show. I know, but a new law can be written, he continued, turning his head to look at her. His winter sky eyes were clear, stripped of the layers of kingship, showing only the man beneath. The law of the king's ward, an advisor, a protector, beholden to no one but the Alpha himself, a position of absolute authority, a position that has been empty since the first king. It was not an apology. It was more than that. It was restitution. It was acknowledgement. It was him offering her a place not just back in the pack, but at its very heart, beside him, forged from her own strength. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, softened by the moonlight, at the profound loneliness she now understood so well. He had not been saved by her. He had been witnessed by her. And in being seen so completely, he had found a way to save himself. She did not give him an answer. She did not need to. She simply turned her gaze back to the valley, and he turned his with her. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures against the vastness of the night. The silence between them no longer a barrier, but a bond. It was not an ending, it was an earned and deeply intimate stillness.